On the other side of the ocean, the Lumiere brothers were working at the same time as Edison. The Lumiere brothers were the first to standardize the use of the 35mm film, which would eventually become the industry standard. The Lumiere brothers were also known for their actualities, what we might consider proto-documentaries, films such as Train Coming Into the Station, Boat at Rough Sea, Baby's First Meal, and Workers Leaving a Factory, were all films about everyday life. I've provided a few links to some of the Lumiere brothers films. Please check those out. Now in the 1890s, viewers had never seen a film before, so they weren't exactly sure what it is that they were watching. Any guess as to how viewers in the 1890s responded to the Lumiere brothers' train arriving at the station? Well, some thought an actual train was coming at them, so they got up and ran out of the theater. Amazing, isn't it? Now, don't worry, there's no need for you to run away from your computer screen. There's no train coming at you. In the early 1890s, the French filmmaker Mellie, who was the subject of Martin Scorsese's somewhat recent film Hugo, became the first to introduce large-scale special effects into film. He was a magician and an inventor, and became one of the first to produce a multiple-scene film. His most famous film was A Trip to the Moon. Of course, it will seem very primitive to you today, but back then this was as awe-inspiring as Star Wars was in the 1970s, or as Avatar was more recently. I've provided a link to Mellie's film for you. Another watershed film in the early development of the cinema was Edwin S. Porter's film The Great Train Robbery. This film was both enormously popular and extremely controversial. As the name denotes, the subject matter is a train robbery. Some people were worried that the film would teach people on a large scale how to rob a train. It's also an extremely violent film for its time. Conservatives felt that in the early 1900s, that film was far too violent and too sexual. So if you've heard that debate today, trust me, it's nothing new. This debate has been around as long as film has. Now, one thing that made this film remarkable in the early 1900s was something that will pass right by you if you're not watching for it. Now, at this point in time, films followed one continuous action. So that once that continuous action was completed, the film was over. Fairly simple. And this film follows that logic for the first few scenes. Essentially, we see robbers board a train, fight with the conductor, rob the passengers, unhitch the locomotive, and ride out into the woods where they look at their spoils. So far, everything is status quo. Now, the cut to watch for is the cut back to the telegraph station, where a little girl finds the telegraph operator tied up on the floor. Now, what made the film unique at this time is this elliptical cut in the narrative. Filmmakers were reluctant to cut elliptically to follow another line of action because they were worried that elliptical cuts might confuse the viewers. But of course, people had been reading novels that experimented with time for well over 100 years and been watching drama that experimented with time through thousands of years. And so we're pretty smart. We know how stories work. And viewers are perfectly capable of following a narrative logic and constructing a clear and coherent sense of fabula, time, and space, even if it's presented out of chronological order. The other thing you should know before viewing the film is the final shot of the bandit firing his gun directly at the camera. Now, this was so immensely popular at the time that many other filmmakers decided to imitate and copy this. Also, exhibitors had the option to show that shot either at the beginning or the end of the film. It was the exhibitor's discretion. Now, these early films were shown in what were called the Nickelodeon Theaters, these little sort of dingy venues that drew an estimated 80 million admissions per week when the population of the United States was only 100 million. That's a pretty impressive figure. Of course, the Nickelodeons were about the only show in town at that time. As early as 1907, cities and states began to establish censorship boards to ensure the cleanliness of movie content. And of course, this prompted filmmakers to self-regulate their content in order to avoid federal censorship, as well as the headaches involved with trying to re-edit films for different markets, some being more conservative than others. During this time, film also graduated from one-reelers, which were about 10 to 12 minutes long, to two-reelers that would last about 20 to 24 minutes. The 1 to 2 reelers would be shown in vaudeville houses, whose focus was really live entertainment, singing, dancing, comedic routines. And so films during this period were shown as supplements to the live attraction. The film that essentially changed everything was D.W. Griffith's 1950 film A Birth of a Nation. Between 1908 and 1913, D.W. Griffith made over 450 films working for Biograph, the largest, most powerful studio at the time. Griffith was a key figure in film history because he was the first to codify the use of a variety of types of shots, from the long shot to the extreme close-up. Again, something that we take for granted today, but at the time the medium shot, or what they called the full shot in the silent era, was the industry standard. However, what Griffith demonstrated was that using a variety of shots could create a more powerful narrative. Griffith was also instrumental in the techniques of both cross-cutting as well as parallel editing. Cross-cutting is cutting between 2 or among 3 or more different lines of action that are taking place at the same time but in different locations. Think, if you will, of the classic scenario of the damsel in distress tied up to the railroad tracks, the hero riding on his horse, and the train rushing towards her on the tracks. This is the classic scenario of cross-cutting par excellence. And this is evidenced in Griffith's film The Birth of a Nation very well. Parallel editing, by contrast, is cutting between 2 or among 3 different lines of action, in which temporal simultaneity is not pertinent. So that's to say, in parallel editing, time is not of the essence. Griffith's film Intolerance demonstrates this technique very eloquently, as he cuts among 4 different plot lines that span thousands of years in human history. In this example, we clearly know these events are not taking place at the same time, and so the cuts are thematic rather than temporal. Also the first to stylistically codify the use of color. Yes, silent films had color through the process of tinting or toning, whereby the filmmakers immersed the film stock into dye. Filmmakers could also add color to film through the laborious process of hand coloring each still. Color was used to signify both day and night, or indoors or outdoors, and also used for toning effects to provide a sense of mood or atmosphere. Griffith was also the first to have his actors rehearse, which was really unheard of in the day. The Birth of a Nation is considered the first modern narrative film, and it was the most expensive film to date. It was extremely extravagant. It cost over $100,000, and it took about 16 weeks to shoot the film. Now at that time it was about 1 week was standard for a feature-length film. So nothing even close to this scale had ever been attempted in film before. And it was an enormous success. It was the first film that was screened at the White House, and then President Woodrow Wilson said it was like watching history written with lightning. The downstroke of the film is that it is embarrassingly racist. I mean, in an unapologetic and egregious way. Now, there are white actors who play African American characters in blackface, which is, while very indefensible, was the custom at the time, so that was not unique to Birth of a Nation. Griffith swore to have been oblivious to its racist overtones, claiming that he had softened the material from the original source, which was Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman, and worked to depict both good black characters as well as evil ones, the same way he had depicted both good white characters and evil white characters as well. Of course, aside from the racist characterizations, the film's theme reinforces the Jim Crow notion of separate but equal. However, it's very difficult, or I'd say downright impossible, to see the equality. Ultimately, the film romanticizes pre-Civil War economic arrangements in the South, whereby the wealthy white plantation owners used African slave labor to make fortunes. It's certainly a hideous part of the American past, and unfortunately in 1915, when the film was released, it spurned controversy as well as stirred racist sentiment, still entrenched in American society. The NAACP tried unsuccessfully to have the film banned, but it also inspired a resurgence in the KKK, which did trouble Griffith. Griffith's next film, Intolerance, was released in 1916, and it was really his defense of Birth of a Nation. Even more epic in scope, Intolerance spans thousands of years in human history as it follows 4 storylines, one set in ancient Babylon, the second is a telling of the Passion of the Christ, the third is set in France in the late 16th century, and the fourth follows a contemporary story set in the United States. All 4 narrative lines explore the concept of intolerance throughout human history. In context, Griffith's statement was that intolerance is not something unique to the American South, surrounding racial issues in the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, but it was something that's been going on for thousands of years and continues until today. In its original release, Intolerance was over 4 hours long. Critics have since hailed the film as one of the greatest films not only of the silent era, but in all of film history. In my opinion, it's far better than The Birth of a Nation, and is indeed worthy to be called one of the best films in history. Unfortunately, it was not critically successful at the time of its original release, which prompted Griffith to cut the film without making a copy of the negative, thereby turning the one film into 2 distinct films, and leaving out a couple of the other plot lines. He released those films separately to try to recoup some of the cost of its production. The result is that film historians who have attempted to reconstruct the original are bereft of about an hour of the original film, which Griffith lost on the cutting room floor. The original version today is about 3 hours and 20 minutes long, and while that might sound like quite an investment in a silent film, in my opinion it's worth it. Griffith's Intolerance was the textbook used by the German and the Soviet filmmakers in the 1920s, and was essentially the inspiration for both the German Expressionist movement as well as the Soviet montage movement. And those would be 2 of the most important film movements of the 1920s, both inspired by Griffith's epic vision.